We're now going to be looking at the ontological argument. I would have to say that sometimes this is the argument that takes a bit longer for it to click, but once it clicks, I think it's something that you will enjoy to explain and to really show off how far you've come with understanding philosophical arguments and how they work. So this argument is very different to the other ones because this is our only a priori and deductive argument. So as I said, with an introduction, in any of the explain essays, what I want you to do is to break down why it's called the ontological argument. With all of the other ones, I want you to break down why it's called the teleological or the cosmological argument. And with this one, we're going to break down what it means to say it's the ontological argument. So ontos means being. And the reason why it's called the ontological argument, because it's an argument based on the nature of God. And what Descartes and Anselm are going to argue is that the nature of God is to exist. And that's a really nice way and a strong way to start an essay. So it's an a priori argument because it's prior to experience. So unlike the design argument, which is based on the experience of the appearance of design and purpose in the world, this one is prior to experience. It's based on a definition of God. And it's deductive because it will bring about a necessary conclusion. So a necessary conclusion doesn't mean it's true. It just means that based on the premises, it leads you to a necessary conclusion. So plus premise 1 plus premise 2 leads you to a conclusion, whereas an inductive argument brings you to a probable conclusion. So in an introduction, if you use the terms a priori and deductive, you must define what they are. Don't just list them, explain what that means. So you're explaining the implications of it being a priori and deductive. Anselm uses in his argument something which is known as reductio ad absurdum. And what this means is that he's going to show that it would be absurd for the opposite conclusion to be true. And that's what reduction to absurdity means, is reducing the opposite idea to absurdity. Now, what's really important is that Anselm wasn't going out there to try and argue that you can't be an atheist. He was just trying to show that it was rational, that it made sense to believe in God. So the book that he writes this in is called Proslogion, and in Proslogion 2 we find his first argument. And with both of Anselm's arguments, he starts with the definition. Remember, it's an a priori argument, and the definition he's going to argue means that God must exist. And the definition is God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And you need to learn that phrase off by heart. Everyone else will, and so you need to. So looking at this argument, he says, so if we take that the definition is that God is the greatest possible being that we can think of, and he says whether you believe in God or not, you would accept this definition. This is what we mean by the idea of God. Now, this thing can either exist only in the mind, or it can exist in the mind and in reality. Now, he then says that it is greater to exist in both reality and in the mind, and not just in the mind alone. So therefore, for God to be the greatest possible being, he must exist in both the mind and in reality. Because if he only existed in the mind, we could think of something which was greater. And therefore, God wouldn't be the greatest possible being, and we would have contradicted ourselves. And that's the reductio ad absurdum part of the argument. The opposite would be absurd because it would have a contradiction. Now, at the bottom, I've got a quotation, and this is a nice way to enhance your argument. Anselm quotes Psalm 14:1. The fool in his heart says there is no God. And there's a bit of a play on word here with the use of the term fool. Because if you say there is no God, you're contradicting yourself. Because what Anselm is saying is that if you use that phrase, you are saying there is no God who must necessarily exist. Because within the idea of God is the idea that he must exist. because of this argument. So what you're saying is there is no God who exists. And so therefore you're kind of contradicting yourself. So he's sort of having a bit of fun here. The fool in his heart says there is no God because you're a fool, because you're saying there is no God, who would then, the idea of the definition of him is existence. The second form of the argument is in Proslogian 3. It starts again with the same definition, but what he's going to be talking about is something that we call in philosophy now contingent and necessary existence. Anselm didn't have these terms. This came about later with Kant's criticism of Descartes' argument. Now, if you find it easier to explain using these terms, you can, but if you can try and use the phrases that Anselm would have, that would be better. And I've colour-coded the word with the phrasing. So again, we have the definition. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, this thing could be thought of as not existing or something which it would be impossible for it to not exist, and that would be necessary existence. He then says it's greater for something not to be able to not exist than something which is possible for it to not exist. So, for example, human, it's possible for it to not exist. We are contingent beings because I can think of a time when I didn't exist, so before I was born, but also there will be time when I die. We are contingent beings, okay? Whereas the idea of God is that it's impossible for him to not exist. That is greater than that. So necessary existence is greater because it's not possible for this thing to not exist. So therefore, to avoid the absurd conclusion that this thing could be a contingent thing, it would be possible for it to not exist, we have to accept that God must necessarily exist and cannot be thought of as not existing, because this is greater. Okay? So a contemporary of Anselm was Gaunilo. Gaunilo was a monk, and so he is a theist, but he disagrees the way that Anselm goes about trying to demonstrate God's existence. And if we know, Gaunilo calls his reply on behalf of the fool. And so what he's referring to there is the Psalm 14 quote that Anselm used. So he's trying to say, look, it is possible to say there is no God. You haven't been successful in the way that you've tried to demonstrate God necessarily existing by using a definition alone. So there are three main criticisms. So the first one, and the way that we're going to remember this is through the example of gossip. Now with this criticism, and to be honest with all of his criticisms, he's criticising the approach of going from an idea, a definition, to demonstrating that something exists. And so he says, like with gossip, if someone tells you something, if it's just an idea, you don't know how reliable that idea is. If I told you, oh, we saw so-and-so kissing someone else down the road. Now, really, what would be better evidence? Me telling you that, like gossip, or actually if you'd seen it for yourself, if that had actually been a sense experience, that you had actually seen it for yourself? Well, most people would say the latter. Seeing it for yourself is more reliable. Whereas gossip, starting from an idea or something that people just imagine, is not as reliable. So he's criticising the approach of Anselm to start with an idea to try and demonstrate that that thing exists in reality. And this one follows on to the second criticism. And the second criticism is Gaunilo doesn't agree with the idea that you can go from something which you say, de dicto, to something in reality, de re. You can't define things into existence. And finally, which is his most famous criticism, is the perfect island criticism. What Gaunilo does here is he puts the idea of the perfect island into Anselm's Proslogian 2. So, for example, my perfect island is the most perfect island that can be thought of. Now, this island could exist in the mind alone, or it could exist in both the mind and reality. Now, it's greater to exist in reality in the mind than the mind alone, and for this to be the greatest possible island that I can think of, it therefore must exist in both reality and the mind than in the mind alone for it to be the greatest possible thing. So therefore, my perfect island exists, but we know it doesn't. And what he's trying to do is to show the weakness in Anselm's argument, that you cannot go from an idea to demonstrating that something exists in reality, because I can actually use Anselm's argument to demonstrate that a perfect island exists that I know doesn't. And he's trying to show that Anselm's argument is actually absurd. Now, Anselm does reply, and he says, hang on a minute, Gaunilo, you cannot compare an island with God. An island is limited, it's a contingent thing, it's possible for it to not exist. Whereas God is different. God is a necessary being. He's not limited, he's unique, and so you cannot compare the two. So my argument works with God because he is the greatest thing you can think of, whereas an island is different. And Plantinga, who is a later writer and supporter of the ontological argument, he also sort of reinforces Anselm's reply, and he says that the island has got no intrinsic maximum. So when we consider the idea of God, he has an intrinsic maximum. He is the most maximally greatest thing we can think of. Whereas an island, you can always kind of improve it. You can add another grain of sand. And so you never really do get to the greatest possible island, whereas God is a different thing completely. So before we move on to looking at Descartes, I just want to remind you of some of the key terminology, and this is something that came about through Kant's criticism of Descartes, but it's something you can use when you're explaining Anselm's ontological argument. So these are analytic and synthetic statements. So an analytic statement is one which is true by definition. The predicate, the quality of something, is contained within the definition, whereas the synthetic statement is something that is only true through experience. So if we take the statement, God exists, as a result of the ontological argument, this now becomes an analytic statement. And this is because the quality, the predicate of existence, is contained within the subject of God, because God must exist according to Proslogian 2 and 3, because by definition he is the greatest possible thing that can be thought of, and he must exist in reality, and he must have necessary existence. So in the same way that all bachelors are unmarried men is part of the idea of bachelors. Okay? Now, Descartes' ontological argument, it's not clear as to whether he had ever read Anselm's argument, so I wouldn't ever introduce it as a development of Anselm's argument. It's just a second type of ontological argument, and it's found in his Meditations on Philosophy, specifically Meditations 5. Now, it's important in an essay that you also talk about the background of Descartes. He's a rationalist, and he's one of the key founders of this school of philosophy, where they believe that you can use your mind to work out truths. And so we again have this sort of rejection of relying on sense and empirical evidence, very similar to Plato's approach. Now, Descartes believed that God had placed within every person the idea of him, so a bit like a trademark and a stamp. So this is where the idea and the definition of God is going to come from. He believed that some things couldn't be doubted, like mathematics, whereas our sense experiences could be doubted. And the other thing he felt that he couldn't doubt was that he is a thinking thing. And this is where we get the famous phrase that Descartes is known for, which is cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He wasn't sure whether he could trust that this world was actually real and that it could be the result of some kind of demon that was tricking us. And so he went through this idea of systematic doubt, doubting everything. And the one thing he couldn't doubt was that he was thinking, that he was doubting. And therefore he could be sure that he existed and his mind existed. And so he felt that if he could use his mind to demonstrate that God existed and other things, then he could trust his senses and he could trust the world around him because it wasn't a result of a demon tricking him. And the other thing that he wanted to sort of demonstrate was that these things like God's existence and other truths were as true as mathematics. They had the same kind of not being able to be doubted. So his argument goes as following. His definition is slightly different to Anselm. He says that God is a supremely perfect being. He believed that existence is perfection. Therefore, for God to be a supremely perfect being, he must exist because he must contain all of these perfections. And so therefore we can see quite a simple argument here where we have a definition which then leads to a necessary conclusion. Now Descartes builds on this and he says that this relationship between God and existence is as necessary as a triangle having 3 sides and angles that add up to 180 degrees. If I took the idea of a triangle having 3 sides away or not having 180 degrees, it wouldn't be a triangle. So if we said that God didn't exist, it would be a ridiculous notion. God would cease to be God in the same way that 3 sides and 180 degrees are necessary. He said that existence was a defining predicate of God in the same way that a defining predicate of a triangle is that it has 3 sides. He also draws another analogy with a mountain and the valley, and you can see this in this quotation here. The fact that I cannot think of a mountain without a valley, it doesn't follow that a mountain and the valley exist anywhere, but simply that a mountain and the valley are mutually inseparable. However, existence is inseparable from God, and hence he really exists. So he's saying, I'm not saying a mountain and a valley necessarily exist, I'm just saying that a mountain and a valley are inseparable. They are together. With God, existence has the same relationship. They are inseparable. So therefore, God must exist. And so what we find is that God exists has become an analytic existential proposition. And what that means is it's an analytic statement about existence. So just as I explained earlier, within the idea of God is existence. Because the definition of God is that he's supremely perfect being and he must contain all perfections. Existence is a perfection, so therefore existence is part of God. And that's a really good way to end any kind of Descartes or Anselm argument, to really demonstrate that you understand how it works by explaining why it's become an analytic statement or an analytic existential proposition. Now, part of your specification is that you have to know how Kant criticised the ontological argument. You could get an entire explain question on this. And so if you did, you would first of all, if it was Kant, explain Descartes, because that's more relevant. Descartes' ontological argument in 1 paragraph, and then you would take a second paragraph for his first criticism and a third paragraph for his second criticism. So his first criticism is that he's trying to say that there isn't any logical contradiction in denying the existence of God. Because as we've seen, if God exists, it's an analytic statement. I can't say there is no God who exists because I would be contradicting myself. In the same way, if I said Jack is a bachelor who is married, I'd be contradicting myself. That would be illogical. And Kant's trying to say it's not illogical. And he says it's not illogical to deny God along with all of his predicates, even if existence is one of them. You just cease to think of it. You deny it, the entire thing. So in the same way, I could just deny a triangle along with all of its attributes, its predicates. His second criticism is one that you can take a bit longer to explain, and it's about this idea that existence is not a predicate. So what Kant tries to do here is to say, okay, so you've got the statement, God exists, and existence apparently is an essential predicate, a defining predicate of God. But is existence a predicate? And Kant would say no. He says that a predicate is something which adds to the concept. You learn something new about it. So if I said my cat had long hair, she has 2 ears, she has whiskers, but then if I said my cat existed, Kant would argue that existence hasn't added anything to my cat at all. It still is the same idea of the cat. And what Kant uses is the idea of 100 gold coins. So if I describe those 100 gold coins, but I said they existed, I've not added anything to them. So therefore, saying God exists, that is not an analytic statement because it's not a predicate. Existence isn't a predicate. Instead, it's a synthetic statement. It's something that you have to go out and look at through evidence and experience. Now, not everyone agrees with Kant here, and actually I find a lot of my students don't, that they feel actually if you say something exists, then you are adding to it. It makes it useful. It means that it actually is here in reality, and so to say I just had an idea of a cat and I could describe her qualities, but then I said she actually existed, that does add something to the idea of the cat. And Charles Hartshorne, he's someone that you can use to agree here. Now, Norman Malcolm, he says the only reason why you could disagree with this idea is that either the existence of God is impossible or necessary. And he says it's not impossible to think of God existing. So that would only be if it was self-contradictory or illogical for God to exist. And so therefore, because it's not impossible, he must therefore necessarily exist. Now, some people have said that Malcolm has gone too far here. He's only shown that God's existence is possible. He hasn't quite shown that God's existence is necessary. Another one which I haven't typed here is that some people have said that you can have analytic existential propositions. So, for example, sci-fi characters don't exist. Now, that is an example of an analytic existential proposition, because the very definition of sci-fi characters or sci-fi is that they're fictional. And so this is an analytic statement about existence because the idea of them not existing is within the definition of being science fiction. There are some strengths to this approach to arguing for the existence of God. And this comes really from it being an a priori and deductive argument. So if the premises are true, the conclusion is necessarily true. And so you're removing that sort of probability which you get with inductive arguments. And if you agree with God's definition as being that than which nothing greater be conceived, or God is supremely perfect being, then the conclusion is necessary. And something you need to think about in your evaluation is how far do you agree with that type of logic. Secondly, being a priori is that it doesn't depend on experience. And if you sort of agree with Descartes and Plato that sometimes our experience and our senses can be deceived or can be wrong, you might prefer to use your mind to demonstrate that something exists. However, the ontological argument does depend on you accepting that you can use your mind, you can use ideas and definitions alone to demonstrate that something actually exists in reality. Now, Thomas Aquinas, he disagreed with this approach, and if we think about his 5 ways, all of his 5 ways are based on a posteriori knowledge. They're based on experience, whether on the idea of cause and effect, as in the second way, the appearance of order and regularity in his design argument in the 5th way, his idea of morality in the 4th way, etc. He doesn't agree that you can just use your mind alone. You have to have experience. And if we take Hume's approach as well to things, he doesn't agree that it's possible to take an idea in one's mind, apply some logic to it, and then reach a conclusion to something actually in reality, something in our universe. You could use that to back up Gaunilo. And Hume also didn't believe that you could treat existence as a predicate. It's not something that can be added or taken away from something, and he believed that you needed to have experience to demonstrate whether something existed or not.